Hello and welcome to an exciting night or day. It's night here, but we're celebrating the opening of a new exhibition at the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center at Colorado College. It's Anna Tsouhlarakis, To Bind or to Burn. And tonight we have Anna Tsouhlarakis with us to discuss the exhibition. Since we are doing it virtually, we're going to do something along the lines of a gallery walkthrough. So we'll be taking you through the exhibition, talking about the various projects that are included, and we'll also be able to take questions from the audience. So if you have anything that comes up, please do share your question and we'll try to incorporate that into the talk. So it's my pleasure to introduce Anna, who is a Navajo, Creek, and Greek artist. She recently has moved to Colorado, where she lives and works and is a professor at UC Boulder. And Anna works in sculpture, installation, also video, and performance art. Her work has been part of national and international exhibitions at venues such as Rush Arts in New York, the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, the National Museum of Art at Duke University, Crystal Bridges Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Native American Arts, the Heard Museum, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. Tsouhlarakis was the Andrew W. Mellon Artist in Residence at Colorado College in 2019-2020 and has participated in various residencies, including Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and Yaddo in Saratoga Springs. She also received her BA from Dartmouth with a degree in Native American Studies and Studio Art, and she received her MFA from Yale University in Sculpture. So please join me. I would think we would all clap for her in welcoming Anna to our opening night.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Polly.
So I had the pleasure of working with Anna for over a year and then planning this exhibition. And the exhibition includes some of the older work, but also works that she was working on as the artist in residence. And so they're kind of grouped in terms of projects, and they span back from 2016, where she was investigating certain themes that then had a resonance as she was completing works here during her residency. She brought a couple of projects with her, and and that was a performance, but also, do you want to explain what it was in addition to a performance, your work called Trace?
Sure. So this body of work dealt with the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement. It was inspired when I was reading a report that came out a few years ago, put out by the Urban Indian Health Institute out of Seattle, about how there were over 500 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women that were open, but that number of possible women reached up well into the thousands. And so in response to that, I was thinking about how the selfie is used as a way of portraiture and a lot of times used in these missing posters. So I asked Native women across all of North America to send me selfies of themselves. And so I received around almost 300 of them. And what my first kind of iteration of utilizing those selfies was this project called Trace, where I created a video and then tried to trace their images as quickly as I could before they disappeared. And so what we're seeing right here is one of the drawings from that. And so the idea that we can't quite ever fully get our hands on those women again, we can't ever bring them back in that way. And so it's always about the kind of remnants and the ghost of what was there. So yeah.
And the video includes over 100 portraits, and most of them are women, but some of them are also girls and children. And one of the points in terms of bringing people's awareness to the issue and the epidemic crisis for Native communities of murdered and missing Indigenous women and children is that it isn't limited to women. That I try to point out that also these were women that you invited through social media to participate in your project. Do you want to describe that, how you do that kind of work with your social media practice?
Yeah, several years ago, I read about a statistic that Native people, Native communities are the highest users of social media in terms of percentage of population. And I became really interested in that because I think because we're usually in rural areas or we're kind of displaced in urban areas, it's harder for us to connect with other Native people and friends and family. And so we use social media to bring, the idea of togetherness, of community, and make it more whole. And we saw that a lot in the pandemic with like the social powwow, all those things on Facebook or Instagram. And so I started using that as a tool kind of early on, like around 2010, to gather information from people, quotes from people, and eventually it turned into imagery as well.
And this project was originally a proposal that was going to the National Portrait Gallery, and I know that you're thinking through what the portraits mean was another important aspect of this work.
Yeah, so I have an upcoming exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And when I was given this opportunity that'll happen within the next couple of years, I started thinking about what it meant for a Native woman to have an opportunity like that, to present something within the gallery space that was my work in there will be performance-based, but will include imagery. And it really hit me hard that this was the only thing I could possibly show. It was, these portraits of women and highlighting this issue, because when we think about portraiture and the National Portrait Gallery, we think of presidents and famous people, but what better place to put the portraits of these women that were part of this project to kind of highlight such an important issue that really, really deals with visibility of, underrepresented communities.
When I was, so I am able to give a few tours here and there in the exhibition gallery spaces. And when we were talking about this with a group of staff, I was talking about the very deep layers that this particular work, but all of your works have in terms of the issues that you're really interested in confronting and bringing awareness to people, that all of the works are drawing on something that you maybe have, I'll call it an educational goal, but maybe it's also like awareness. Can you talk about a little bit to our audience about what that, how important education is in terms of your work? And awareness, right? Not education as in you'll walk away with 5 or 6 dates and all of the events, with the right characters in mind, but that what kind of awareness you're trying to bring to our audiences.
I think just like art, education has a lot of different layers to it. And I'm really interested in thinking about education in different ways. I've been teaching for over, 16 years now in lots of different age groups and, different levels of institution. And so for me, breaking down educational theories and creating that, using that as a structure to kind of utilize my art and kind of use my voice has always been interesting to me. So specifically with these pieces of trait and the drawings, those deal with the idea of exquisite corpse drawing, an exercise that's usually in an intro to art, drawing class or something like that, where everyone kind of sits around and takes turn all working on the same image or drawing. And so that's why within this piece, instead of the artist kind of moving along and working on different pieces, this I'm looking at different images and trying to draw all those things on one piece of paper. And so the idea, this exercise is called an exquisite corpse, this way of drawing. And so I like that undertone of what that means kind of rolled in with the movement of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
And I also talk to people about the, and when I explain how the the social media was part of the practice, that people lent you their portraits, and then how you created sort of this parameter using the video to create the portrait drawings. Then each drawing, when we enter the gallery, we can see how different each attempt at capturing, I hate that word, sorry, but I keep using it, but it's not what the word I want to say, but you're drawing these portraits and trying to create something that gives that person's face a presence in this overall portrait. I also like to talk to people about how there's a release of control that you as an artist also offer, I think, in much of your work. There's maybe a tension there about control and release that I think is really important in looking at things, and also in how audiences respond, right, to what you intend and then how they might respond to it. Do you feel like that is something that is part of this deeper understanding of your understanding how Native art is presented in galleries and museum contexts?
I do. I think, a lot of this is informed by my own experiences kind of growing up and traveling with my dad to different art markets, and when he was selling jewelry, and about how, a lot of times people's view of Native art is very one-sided. It's very flat. And this, I love the idea that these things actually have a lot more meaning to them, be it, a sculpture, a performance piece, or a piece of jewelry that's telling a story, about a specific person or a specific, tribal story that might be connected to the tribe or to land or to a specific community. And so I think it's important to kind of bring attention to that we're multidimensional people and we create things that are very complex and are complicated and aren't always so beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So this will take us to our next. So in the gallery, as we're doing this walkthrough, we would approach the next sculpture called Edges of the Ephemeral, which is really an installation, but in our show, we moved the sculpture into the inside instead of it being outside, and we have some images of the gallery installation here. I'm going to move this way. Do you want to talk a little bit about what this sculpture is and how it came to be?
Yep. So this sculpture has been created installed several places throughout the United States, and it first came about when I was given a prompt for a statewide exhibition in New Mexico to create something dealing with ideas of time. And it was one of the first times that I started really using social media as the basis for a project. And so I emailed and kind of put a call out on social media, as well as an email to different people, and trying to get answers from Navajos, basically. I sent a survey monkey out to all the Navajos I knew, to people that thought, that might know other Navajos, to try to get an understanding of what people were thinking about when we think about ideas of harmony within our world. And when I think about that, I think about the different worlds in our traditional stories. How, we were in the first world and we're in the second world, and how the worlds were created, and are there worlds after this? There were worlds before us that were just made up of insects and that were all water, and how that, we've gone into different worlds, and there's different, pros and cons of those worlds. And so I ended up getting a lot of feedback from over 60 different Navajos, and I was really excited about having other people involved. I don't necessarily think about myself as a community artist, but I'm definitely an artist that utilizes my community. And the use of social media was just another way for me to really get involved and bring people into the process that maybe weren't a part of, contemporary art and installations before. And so I had this idea to use the aluminum signage to create, to really solidify their text and make it permanent, to make it visible. And I feel like when you see construction signs or, traffic signs, it's important and you have to read it. And I like that kind of implicit push for, or understanding in terms of, the words that they were kind of putting forth. And so I took bits of their text, put them on signs, and I wanted, when we think about ideas of harmony, it's about, the good and the bad, the hard and the soft. It's always about these, oppositions and how they're balancing out each other. And so I started thinking about, okay, what's the opposite of this aluminum signage? And I started thinking back to, where my family's from in New Mexico. And, we have this old barnwood, this old wood from corrals and sheep corrals and horse corrals and old, houses that people have kind of left. And so I went, with my dad, and we went and collected all of this old wood from our land. And that became the base, the foundation of the sculpture, which I think is important because that brought my land, my family, my story into this idea of an installation as the foundation for it that supported all of these words. And so when I was thinking about the shape that I wanted to do, I like the idea of an archetypal spiral because we see it, in so many paintings that are, thousands of years old, to like the spiral jetty in Utah. And so incorporating something like that's significant and used within, mathematical ideas of beauty, but, also representations of life, different things like that. And so those were kind of all the different layers of that sculpture. And so I love putting it together every time I do because it comes out a little different, and there's so many memories, both within the wood and in the signage and the text, and sometimes how I can pull out, the wording and remember that it was somebody specific, maybe from the South, that used those words. And so I love that piece.
Yeah. And I was, very fortunate to get to be, I wouldn't call myself part of the installation, but I was there and seeing it happen, and to see it, grow and form. It was a really, amazing experience. Sort of knowing what was coming, but then also seeing it, rise up out of the ground was the way it felt. And, so, when we're doing these programs these days, during our COVID pandemic, most of the time we're ignoring that topic, right? Most of the time we're seeing things online, dismiss that kind of contemporary moment because we don't want to really be reminded when we're doing things like attending art openings, such as this is, right? But you and I started working on the show over a year ago, and we had no idea what was coming, and all of this work was created before the pandemic. We imagined something very different, and when we were talking about which works to include, we were going to do this outside. But the thing for me was in just reviewing the history of your work, and what might lead to important discussions for our community, and to help us think about how Indigenous knowledge impacts our lives and also can help us to recover and get through this. This piece really had new relevance to me, especially that one, the sign that I included in the slideshow here, which was, some of us won't make it. And many of us, some of us will be swept away. And that's a message from Navajo teaching, but it's also thinking about what is our contemporary moment. And I think to imagine that what contemporary art is, what art is doing, but what contemporary art is doing right now. I really felt like there was this very renewed importance about this particular work. And I know I mentioned that to you in the conversation. I don't know how much it changed your thinking about what we were doing as we installed it.
No, I mean, that's the thing, is that we have these teachings that kind of heard our entire life. And you never know when they're going to be important, like when your grandma yells at you tonight, not whistle outside at night or something, or, not to like look at an eclipse or something like that. And it doesn't become real until it does, and it becomes relevant. And then you see that these teachings are true teachings that have been around, since we began as people. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason that there's continuum in our history and our traditions, and that we're still utilizing them. They're not hollow words. And I think that's a lot of times when we think about like Native American stories or legends, we think of them as being light and hollow in some ways, is that they're this ethereal being that's just passing through, but they're meaningful. And they're based and they're founded in like very real things. And so I think that makes complete sense, that this installation has renewed meaning now.
So another project that was kind of a sign related project, but also like deeply embedded into social media, as well as like the built world that we pass by in your messaging, was the Native Guide project. That was one of the first projects you did here in Colorado Springs. And this was a project you did through Instagram and through billboards. So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about not only the messaging, but also your occupation of the commercial advertising space.
So I think, when I think about this specific project, I can't pin down exactly when this idea came to me. And I think that part of it was us moving from a really urban area, Washington, D.C., to Colorado Springs, and how in Washington, D.C., I was inundated daily with racism, with microaggressions, with the Washington football team logo in my face everywhere I went. And it was a daily thing that I always had to be aware of, that, when I walked into a store, I always wondered, how am I going to be treated? Am I going to be served, politely? Am I going to be given all the options for what's on the menu, or are they going to decide for me? And so I think when I came to Colorado Springs, it was a very different place. Probably, I think part of it was that, Native Americans are much more of the population. It wouldn't be it's not a big deal when you see another Native at the gas station at the grocery store. Although I was so excited when I would see.
I feel exactly the same way. Yes, exactly.
So, but yeah, so eventually I got used to it. But I started thinking about that anxiety that I always had, being in a very urban place and a very different place away from, larger Native communities. And I started thinking about, now I'm, my studio was in the museum at that time. And what did that mean, like in terms of my interaction with people that were coming through the museum as an artist, thinking of myself as an object within the museum, and the layering of education with that. And so in thinking about how I may have reacted, when I was out east, and, a lot more fiery in my responses, would be an understatement. But thinking about that way of dealing with things, and then now that I'm in a museum, I should have a more controlled, voice and a better way of communicating. And so I kind of dug into my history of teaching and thinking about that. There's an educational theory called the responsive classroom. And basically this idea that, you're helping, it's basically about positive reinforcement. So if you see some kids, running down the hallway, but you see there's like one or two kids walking, you're like, oh, I really like how so-and-so's walking, and so just letting people know that you're paying attention to these people that are doing things really well and respectfully. And so I started thinking about that in terms of racial relations. And so the first kind of one of these sayings I came up with was, I really like the way that you respect Native American rights. And, right off the bat, that I realized, I love that idea of trying to groom people to be respectful. Like if they read this, maybe they'd think, oh, I do that. Or, so I started thinking about that, and then I started coming up with more of these. And as I always do, I started emailing a whole bunch of my friends and texting and, asking people what they thought, important kind of subject matter would be to kind of touch upon. And, of course, like, by now, tons of all my friends know that I ask for help and for suggestions and ideas and getting this out there and getting, projects out there. And so I started hearing about like Halloween costumes and, mascots and hair and different things like that. And so I started thinking about how I wanted to get these things out there. And I didn't want them to be about me. I didn't want it to be my voice that was out there. So I decided that the voice would be, very, very formal, but kind of pushed out into the world without any contact or knowledge about where it was coming from. And so that's where the idea of the billboards came from. And then throughout the month of November in 2019, I also pushed all of these 23 different kind of text pieces out on social media, both on Facebook and Instagram, and pushed them out as ads. And so there was no connection to me, to my name or anything. But I was really interested in just having these appear in people's feeds, the way that advertisements, kind of appear, and you don't know why they're necessarily affecting you or why they're popping up in your on your screen. And so I ended up every day I would push kind of the advertisements of these posts out. Probably two or three posts per day. And then by the end of the month, I was able to see, because of the analytics, that it had reached around 30 to 35,000 people. And so that was really, really exciting to know that people, had impressions of it or interacted with it in different ways. And so it was an anonymous project in a lot of ways, but I thought like a very important project for me to do.
And so we have a question from Patty, and she asks, why do you use black and white text in all caps in this project?
So in a lot of my work, so I'm a trained sculptor, let's start with that. And I don't feel comfortable in color, as you can see with my, black.
I felt like I could take a risk here tonight with the rust.
I mean, anybody that knows me knows that these are a big jump for me to have yellow earrings on. I'm not a fan of color because I don't fully understand it, I would say. And, but I also think that when you're an artist of color, there are so many kind of ways that people want to define who you are. And when you use color, it becomes very specific. And I feel that it becomes much more weighted than I want it to. If I use pink, does that mean that I'm girly? Does that mean that, my skin is pink? Or is that because I'm a lighter Indian because I'm like not fully red or something? I don't know. And so all of these things become parts of that conversation. And so I just want to, basically strip the conversation down to like the real meat of it. And for me, that's the text. And so that's why I use, very simple, minimalist text, very, basic color, the most basic color palette really you can use, because I don't want to add any more fluff to it. I just want it to be what it is.
So let's go back to the gallery space. Those were an outdoor project that Anna did, and we've let's call it collected, as I'm a curator. We collected these billboard printed vinyls, and we saved them for the show. So here they're installed in the gallery. The one spanning across the gallery is about 15 feet wide, to give you a sense of their scale. Anna, this had, I know, a really big impact on you when you saw it. I don't know if you want to share that, or if I can just like remind you.
No, I mean, so, I had seen obviously the billboards up in town when I was here in my residency, but to see a space, to see them fill the space the way they do in the gallery, not to promote but to promote the exhibition, I guess. I feel like this is one of those things you truly have to see in person. I mean, the impact of seeing those words and having it just kind of envelop you is it's amazing. I mean, I was so excited, and shout out to the installers. They did a phenomenal job, and really blew me away. I was, I know it's my own artwork, but I was almost in tears.
And I think it's we have had a number of Native women in this space. That I've curated through. We had previously had Rebecca Belmore. We had Nora Naranjo Morris. We had Melanie Yazzie downstairs. We had Christine Howard Sandoval around the corner. And so for me, being a person who's in that space, very often, it also was an amazing moment to feel those words so large, that you're part of this trajectory of exhibitions that we've been able to host, but that it also becomes something that you can't ignore. It isn't an Instagram flash where you move on. And when you're in the gallery space, I really feel like it takes on a whole nother, like very bold experience that maybe we would have had with you in DC. I don't know, but so as you were working, just to move on to the next section in the gallery, you also had a series of performance videos and sculpture. So we're going to show a few of those. There's a whole gallery that's includes the work called Incomplete Drawings of Decolonization. And so can you come to describe a few of these images? This was a performance, and for people who don't know Anna's work, she typically performs alone in her studio.
So this was part of the project was called Incomplete Drawings of Decolonization. So when I started, when we moved to Colorado Springs and I started working in my studio at the museum, I started to think not only about, thinking about like race relations in the world, but also kind of the things that were happening within academia and larger institutions. And even now, decolonization is one of, the hot words to use. And, I started thinking about what exactly does that mean? How does one become decolonized? How does one become, a decolonizer? And so trying to break that down and thinking about what that meant, I started thinking about the way, like, to be decolonized or decolonizer, and you're an Indigenous person, what does it mean to be indigenized? What is it that makes you Native? And what is it that separates those two, the person that needs to be decolonized and the Indigenous person? And so in thinking about that, I started thinking about like our traditions and what are the ways that I was raised that makes me possibly become a decolonizer. And I started thinking about how, even at the very beginning when you're a baby, a Native baby, you're put in a cradle board. And the idea of being wrapped in a cradle board is that, a baby can't quite control all their extremities. And so we wrap them like that, and that helps soothe them. It gives them peace. And, at a very young age, I was taught to brush my hair and to like put it up in, a braid or a ponytail or a bun, but always taking care of that and taking time to brush your hair every day and to care for it, because that's your mind. That's your hair is coming out of your head. And that's, very important to kind of be respectful of your hair, because that's your memory. That's your, that's your tradition right there. That's like one of the visualizations of tradition. And so, and also my grandma used to say, when we brush our hair every day, that's clearing your mind and it's helping calm you down. So when you go through your day, you're going to have a good day. You're not going to, if your hair is all crazy and different, all tangled up, you're going to have a day like that. And so that helps guide your path through your day, through your week, through your life. And so in thinking about that, I started thinking about, are these the ways that we decolonize things? Would that be a way that maybe I was a being that wasn't, Indigenous, and this is what indigenized me basically. And so I started thinking about all the different ways that we use wrapping or binding, and thinking about that with like medicine bundles or, sage or different things. And so being a performance artist, I feel like sometimes for me, performance is an easy way for me to enter an idea, because it's not super formal. I feel like I'm allowed to be spontaneous because there's no object necessarily that's being made. And so that's where the piece with the wrapping of the head with the sinew came from, was this idea like, okay, if I was going to decolonize myself or decolonize something, it would be with, the sinew that I had in my studio. And I just started going for it. And one of my performance pieces came out of that. And so while I was, thinking about all this, I was also trying to think about if I'm a decolonizer, if I'm the Indigenous person, what is the object that needs to be decolonized? What is the thing that needs to be kind of stripped of Western ideas or, philosophies? And so I started thinking about like the basis of like contemporary sculpture and contemporary art. And in my mind, I think of minimalist art, and it really brought silhouette to the forefront, because when you're in a sculpture class, or if you're talking about, sculpture theory, or, it really, he is considered like, the maker of like the basic form of sculpture. And so when I was thinking about his work, I, reread a lot of interviews with him and books that were about, a lot of his exhibitions during the late 60s and 70s. And it really brought me back to his project of incomplete drawings of cubes. And so that's where the idea of utilizing minimalist art as a stand-in for objects that need to be decolonized came from.
So let's pull up a few images of the sculpture. And while we do that, there was a question from David Elijah Brown. And he says, "Hi, Anna. I'm curious about your concepts of form and material. How would you say that they inform or play with meaning in your work?"
I think I'm very specific with just like the text. I don't want to use excess of things necessarily. I want it to be about like that specific material that I'm using, whatever that might be at that time. And there's layered meaning with that specific, like even within the performance, where I'm wrapping my head, the sinew I'm using is actually artificial sinew, which I thought was very significant because just of our time and place of things is, like where am I going to get real sinew at this point, and that's what we really utilize when we're making outfits for powwows or different things, and that's the norm now. And so it was important for me to use specifically like artificial sinew.
So the title of this exhibition is To Bind or to Burn. And you and I know that this, of course, comes from referencing also a series, in addition to what you just talked about, a series of fire and ash drawings that are in the exhibition. I think we have number 3, which I believe was copies of the Dawes Act that you burned. So can you share with us like how these drawings came to be?
Yeah. So in thinking about ideas of decolonization, one way I was thinking about it is to the visualization of this. So not only in sculpture, but how would you create something two-dimensional that would utilize that same idea of almost like rejuvenation or kind of rebirth in a way. And so when we think about that, in a lot of our native ways, we use ash, or you burn different things and you have that ash, or it might be a specific color or a specific smell, and there's going to be intention for that to be used as medicine or for prayers or different things. And so I decided that I wanted to burn kind of significant documents. So I burned, a copy of the Declaration of Independence. I burned the Bible, and I burned the Book of Mormon. And these things were burned.
I just want people to know that these weren't the actual documents. These are copies of the documents. So
yes,
make sure people know what we're doing.
Yeah. And, So they were burned on larger pieces of paper, really thick pieces of paper. And so as it was being moved around and kind of, so we could get the flame and the marks on the paper, that's what you're seeing is the actual burning. And that's what's making up the drawing. They're not marks that I made necessarily with my hand, but it's the action of the fire and the burning and the decolonization, if you will, of the objects that's creating the imagery.
I think it's really interesting how you're talking about how you're bringing a cultural practice that you have and knowledge about what the role of fire and ashes plays in your world, and then how that might be seen really differently, right? Like, so someone else might bring to this as, if it's an act of decolonization, it's an act of destruction. And I think it's really interesting how those two things are related, and a person may not know what you're bringing to it from your cultural understanding, but can bring to themselves, what does it mean to burn these words? They're not the actual objects, but the words that they, and the implications that all of those words brought about into native world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is, another example that I feel like is one of those things where you're releasing control over how people perceive your work, that you're, we didn't decide to explain the whole cultural background of your use of fire here, but that there's still something that people can bring to themselves and interpret what you're doing. There's also another video in the gallery. We have an image of this that's called Known Paths. And this was a short residency that you also did last year, well, in 2020, I guess, before we had lockdown. I don't remember if it was 2019 or 2020, but can you describe a little bit about what this project was?
Yeah. So I was brought to Haverford College in Pennsylvania as a resident for the week. And Haverford's a Quaker college, and they have a huge archive of Quaker documents. And so I spent my time that week looking through their archives and finding around 3,000 pages of documents dealing with Quaker and Native relations, and eventually made copies of all of those documents and burned them and used the ash and the performance that was in the main kind of quad of Haverford College.
So one of the questions that I got while giving a tour to students in the gallery was, what was the significance of the building in the background? And I think it's the library, right?
It's one of their major buildings, like their most iconic buildings on campus.
And so my way of talking to the student was to think about, well, we might not know what the building is, and we might not know the significance of its history, right, in terms of the campus or even in what your project is, but by the look of the building, kind of, I'm going to say, reeks of colonialism. And so that I think that decolonizing action is there as well, and the relationship of the, and now you're talking about the ritual, but that relationship of the destruction and the healing and that resolving of that history with the Quakers, which, gets a lot of good press, but maybe it's not all positive, right? We do have time for a few more questions before we finish up. And one of the questions that recently came in was from Blair. And she says, Anna, thanks so much for your time tonight and for sharing your work with us. Could you talk a bit about how you see the role of humor in your work?
I think that humor plays a big part because, I went to school at Dartmouth, which was super serious and very academic. And I think that one of my favorite parts of being, a student at a place like that are, the people that you meet, the professors that you have that kind of lighten things up. And just my whole, experience of being an educator, the past, decade and a half, and realizing that, when I give, information, or if I'm presenting artwork, that I don't want it to be super heavy. I don't want it to be arduous. I like the goofiness of things. In my work, I always want to have that bent of being, informal and spontaneous. There is obviously serious parts to it, but when we think about the identity of Native peoples, a lot of times it is heavy and filled with, a lot of history, which is good, but we're also hilarious people and we're complex people. And I think having that bent of humor adds to that and is a really important part, because that's one of the main reasons we've made it so long, is we're able to laugh while we live.
Another question just came in from Felix Sanchez. What do you take away from the critiques by Native people of your specific work versus by non-Natives? So, yeah.
I think, I make my work for Native people. I think that, when I'm thinking of work, I'm not necessarily always thinking about what non-Natives are thinking about it, because I don't want to be driven by that. I want to be driven by my own community, my own family, and my own history. And I think that's part of like where the humor comes from. And of course I take it into account how they may view it, but, and so in the presentation, I do my best in being my true, having my true voice in that, but it comes out however it comes out. And I think with critiques, like I think about the billboards, they were in Colorado Springs, which is a very conservative community. And I think people thought I was being super sarcastic with the billboards, even though for me, the intention, was very educational. It wasn't meant to be kind of, talking down to people or being sarcastic, but that's the way some people took it. There were, news reporters involved and TV stations that wanted to interview me because that's the way they were taking it. And, just like most things that we do in life as Native people, we go forward and we put our voice out there. And sometimes people don't hear what you say, they hear what they want to hear. That's just what it is sometimes.
Well, I think it was an interesting moment that just happened sort of in an unexpected way, was that you launched these in November, but it was the 1 year that the President of the United States did not acknowledge Native History Month. Instead, it was going to be American History Month or something. So it was really interesting, I think, to put that, it was just fate, but it was like serendipitous, is that the word? That, this happened, this call for respecting Native rights was public in the exact moment that, our histories were not being acknowledged, celebrated, honored, and respected, right? Like our contribution to the American fabric is not being acknowledged. Or was only being acknowledged as one part of everything else, right? And how that impacted, I think, how people saw it was big. The other thing I'm thinking too is, my sister is involved in education of very young ones, and I think the other part of the language in the Native Guide Project is that people aren't used to being complimented in certain ways, right? So the way that we would talk to children is not really the way we would kind of, give positive reinforcement to other adults. So that might be another way that people are reading it, is it's such an unusual thing for someone to say, oh, I really like the way that you do that. We usually will say something like, oh, I really like your shirt today, but you wouldn't say, I really like the way you get dressed every morning. So that's kind of fun. Mm-hmm. So I guess we have one more question before the end, and this is coming from Cecilia Ammon. She says, can you talk more about the element of healing that comes out of your work for you and for the viewers?
I've never really thought about it that way. the idea of healing through my work. I think that there are elements that renew people, and I guess that's maybe what, like when I think about, you know, when natives see my work or people make connections to the text that might be in the work, you know, it's that connection that brings you joy, right? That makes you feel like you're renewed or maybe healing in some way. You know, with the billboards, like I think about the Native people that were in touch with me when they found out that those were my, you know, that I had put those out there, and how empowered they felt. And I think, you know, that's one of the biggest things for me, is that the idea of empowerment, of Native voice, of Native stories. And so, you know, I think about the empowerment of Native women. I'm not, you know, your stereotypical, you know, thin, like exoticized Native woman, what we might think about like in that realm of things. And so the idea that I'm putting myself in these videos is very real. And so if other Native women see me, you know, allowing my image to be out there, it becomes empowering. And I think talking about these ideas of like binding, of like, you know, using a cradle board, or like, you know, tying your hair back and, you know, paying attention to that every day, it becomes empowering, and it becomes, and people connect with that, and they realize like, okay, I'm like that too. And this is being viewed by a lot of people. And I know that, you know, my story is getting out there too. So I don't know, for me, I'm excited for people to make those connections. And in a lot of ways, I assume they're going to be Native people, but I know it's not always the case. And I, especially specifically with the text pieces, I feel like people can make connections at a lot of different levels with a lot of different backgrounds. And so, I mean, that's the way art is anyway. You know, people are bringing their own stories and experiences and able to translate, you know, different things they're seeing in their own way. So.
Thank you so much, Anna. I do want to respect everyone's time, and it's been a wonderful moment to celebrate this long project, and I'm so glad that we got to complete it, even in regard to the world that we're in. The exhibition, we will have it open for an extended, this is my little advertisement moment, it will be open for an extended time because we're not open to full public. So it's running through August 21st. So there's lots of chances to come in and experience the work. And I do want to also thank our funder for this, your fellowship, your residency, and also this exhibition and the forthcoming catalog. These were all through a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for Southwest Arts and Culture. And it's just been my, great pleasure, Anna, to work with you and get to know you and have such a close hand in putting your works together here. It's just been fantastic for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you to everyone at the FAC and Colorado College. It's been awesome. So,
and we look forward to seeing more of your work, and it's wonderful that we can celebrate a Colorado artist here at the Fine Arts Center.